Kind of cover, oh, Ryan, do you want to cover?
I'll wave my hand I'm waving my hand to the person who's in charge of the mic. You can wave back if you want. I see what you're doing there.
Also to Tracy.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Boy, got a gavel sitting up here from the mayor, so we'll gavel the meeting to start here. I'm Ron Latz, I'm your state senator. Represent Senate District 46 here, St. Louis Park, Hopkins, about half of Golden Valley, all of Medicine Lake, and a quarter of Plymouth. And we welcome you to our beginning of session town hall meeting. You'll notice the folks up front here. We've had sort of a rotating cast in the last several years, but I'm pleased to be back up here with Representative Ryan Winkler and to still be up here with Representative Cheryl Iwakim. So we're going to let them introduce themselves briefly, then I'll introduce myself a little further, and then we'll go into some conversation about the upcoming legislative session. We will share with you our thoughts, but most importantly, we want to hear your thoughts. So when it's time and you have questions or comments, we ask you to step forward here so that the cameras can pick you up and you'll speak into the microphone. Those who are watching on the community cable channels and on YouTube will be able to hear your questions. And we welcome any and all comments. This is a nonpartisan event, so we caution people to keep partisan comments to a minimum, and also to respect each other whenever they say something you may disagree with. We all have a right to be heard and respectfully, and that's an important part of our democratic process. So to my left, Cheryl Iwakim. Representative Iwakim.
Representative Cheryl Joachim, and great to be here tonight. I represent all of Hopkins and half of St. Louis Park, mostly south of Minnetonka Boulevard.
Good evening, Ryan Winkler. I am newly sworn in as a representative for the northern half of the Senate District 46A. So that's St. Louis Park, roughly north of Minnetonka Boulevard, the southern half of Golden Valley, roughly south of 55, and Plymouth and Medicine Lake. And I'm very happy to be here and appreciate all of you for turning out. This is a very large crowd, and I hope it makes for a very robust discussion tonight.
We are going to go until 7:30 in the formal portion of this event. Anyone who wishes to stick around after that time to have some conversation, that's just fine. But we figure we just appreciate your coming out on an evening here to join us. Before we go any further, I do want to introduce our county commissioner and the newly elected chair of the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners. Marianne Green has joined us. Marianne.
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you, neighbors, for being here tonight. It's such a great team that we get to work with and serve us in the legislature, so thank you so much. I'm Marianne Green. I'm your county commissioner, and I am newly elected as the chair of the Hennepin County Board. I'm very excited about that. I just want to ask you to email me if you get a chance in the next day, because my monthly newsletter is going to be coming out, and it tells you it gives you a view of the year ahead, 2019. So would love to hear from you and engage with you. I don't have the same kind of intense season of activity the way our legislators do, but always look forward to hearing from you and working on your behalf and engaging with you. So thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. And for those of you listening at home, she invites you to email her so that you can get on the email list. Marion, what's your email address?
It's Marion with an O dot green with an E at hennepin.us.
Marion with an O dot green with an E at hennepin.us.
Thank you.
All right. Very good. Thank you. By way of brief introduction, I'm a resident in St. Louis Park. I grew up in Golden Valley. I'm married. I have 3 children, one in college, one in high school, one in elementary school. In private practice, I'm a lawyer. I have my own small business, private legal practice. And I've served in the legislature after serving 9 years on the city council here in this chambers, and then 4 years in the House. And then since 2007, in January 2007, I've served in the state Senate. Succeeded Steve Kelly in that seat, who is our newly appointed Commissioner of Commerce for the state of Minnesota. And I'm sure he will do an outstanding job representing the people of the state and heading an agency that is the foremost consumer advocacy agency in the state of Minnesota, with the possible exception of the Attorney General's office, which has some jurisdiction there as well. I serve on 2 committees in the Senate right now. I am the lead Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, the minority lead. And when we were in the majority, I was chair of the Judiciary Committee. Our body has flipped majority and minority a couple of times in the last several years. I also serve on the Senate Commerce Committee, the Commerce and Consumer Protection Committee. So there we deal with issues like insurance, and a variety of consumer protection issues. In the Judiciary Committee, we handle civil law questions, the budget for the courts, the Department of Corrections, which is the state prisons, the Department of Public Safety, and criminal law issues as well. So that's sort of my portfolio in the legislature. I think if we want to spend should I jump into some policy conversation now, or
Sure,
do you guys
yeah.
want to talk a little bit more
Go
about
for
your background before we do that?
Why don't the Senate lay out the policy positions and go ahead?
All right, well, so we'll do that. So this is we're in a 2-year budget cycle in the state of Minnesota. Our primary constitutional obligation this spring is to pass a budget for the state of Minnesota for the coming 2 years that will begin July 1st. It'll be roughly a $48 billion budget over the 2-year period. And about 41% of that budget is education. About a third of that is HHS, Health and Human Services. And then we have transportation in there, some of which is within the general fund budget and some of which is specially funded revenue accounts. And then we have a whole range of other areas of Department of Human Rights, for example, the issues with the environment, Department of Natural Resources. All of these are up for evaluation this year, and we'll be making budgetary decisions. We have a nominal surplus moving forward, which is a big change from 8 years ago when we had about a $5 billion shortfall. But I want to explain this a little bit, because what gets headlines as a surplus really isn't as much of a surplus as people think. You say surplus, everyone begins to think, well, we can refund all sorts of extra revenue as tax refunds, or we can reduce taxes. We can increase spending on areas that we care most about, we think are the highest priorities. But the bottom line is, while that forecast revenue increase over expenditures that are projected is about $873 million, we have a weird way of forecasting in the state, because we calculate inflation in the projected revenues, but we don't calculate inflation for the projected spending, which is to say, if we want to maintain the current level of services, we will have to pay more to do that, because the cost of delivering services continues to go up with normal inflation. Services are affected just like our own household budgets. There's gas, there's electricity, there's costs of labor, or the human part of delivering the services to the people of Minnesota. And if you factor in inflation on the expenditure side, the inflationary estimate is $1.162 billion. to maintain current level of services. So that tells you pretty quickly, we are already used up the projected budget surplus, and we're short a little bit from that standpoint. There are also obviously lots of demands in Minnesota for services, ranging from our K-12 education system to early childhood education, and a variety of other areas. Higher ed, University of Minnesota and Minnesota State as well. So there will be a lot of conversation this year about how we handle this budget, whether we wish to find new sources of revenue, whether, and one of those that being talked about is what to do with regard to the Healthcare Access Fund and the healthcare provider tax, which is scheduled to blink off, and which will create a $600 to $700 million reduction in projected revenues over the next biennium. These conversations will take place in the budget committees, the finance committees in the House and the Senate. In addition to all of these budgetary items, there are a variety of other bills that are going to be coming before us. And I'll just touch real briefly on a couple of the hot button ones that I expect to see through the committees that I'm on. I am the chief author, or will be the chief author once we introduce them, of the two bills aimed at reducing gun violence in Minnesota. A background check, a bill expanding that to close the loopholes for gun shows and private sales, and also a red flag bill to give courts the ability to remove firearms from the hands of those who are facing emotional crises at any particular moment and become a danger to themselves and others around them. I expect that gun violence more generally, but in particular, these two bills will be a topic of some discussion this year. Many of you have heard about some of the deaths that we've had in our state prisons, the prison guards that have been attacked by inmates. We'll have a lot of conversation around that this year. In particular, the Department of Corrections is going to be asking for a substantial increase in staffing at the prisons. I will add that staffing isn't the only issue with regard to safety in the prisons. Some of that is finding ways to address grievances more effectively. To that end, I'll be introducing a bill to reinstate the ombudsman position or ombudsperson position in the Department of Corrections. I expect we'll have a lot of conversation this year around the topic of whether or not to legalize recreational use of marijuana in Minnesota. Although personally, I think that this budget session is probably not the session we're going to be passing anything. It might happen in another year because we have a wide range of topics to discuss relating to that. We can certainly get into more if you wish. But it's a heavy lift in a session where we've got a budget to deal with. We also have a capital investment bill that we expect we'll be dealing with for investment in our infrastructure. So those are a couple of highlights, and I know that the parts of the budgets I haven't talked about will be talked about by my colleagues here. So let's turn it over to Representative Yoakim.
Thank you, Senator Latz. So I've lived in Hopkins for almost 22 years with my husband and our 3 kids we've raised there. And I work during interim as a support specialist in the schools and was blessed to work at Aquila Elementary this interim in this fall before the session started with children with special needs. And today I had an opportunity to FaceTime one of them that had wanted to talk to me because they missed me, which made me feel really good, but I missed them 10 times more. But now we're back at session, and that's a whole different group of people to be working with, and it's very exciting. Since the House was, we came back in the majority as Democrats in the House, so now committees shifted around, offices moved. Currently, I am the Education Policy Chair. I also serve on the Education Finance Committee, the Transportation Finance and Policy Division, and the Full Tax Committee. So it's a unique opportunity to really dig in and get some really good work done. Our committees are just starting to do that work. And instead of having like this first few weeks, we generally have kind of some overviews of what's in your issue area, what's in your budget area. But a lot of us are kind of approaching it in a different way. For instance, in education policy, this week we spent time learning about the rules schools are living under, the funding streams they have, the stakeholders that work with the schools. But next week, we're going to spend time finding out about the kids. We're doing a joint hearing, a whole entire hearing on mental health in our schools. We're also going to have the Homegrown Bar Center come in and talk about assets kids have and the Search Institute and get a really good picture for our committee about the kinds of children that are in our school settings and what we need to do to make sure that they can succeed. So that hopefully when we start our policy discussions, we come up with some good policy that'll drive some systemic change. Other than that's why the committees are starting to go. We also introduced and Majority Leader Winkler might talk about this too, but we introduced our first 10 first 10 bills in the House. And while they're not by any means comprehensive about what we want to tackle this year, they were based on a project we did over the last 2 years, going around the entire state and talking to Minnesotans to find out what mattered the most to them. And after those 2 years, we really found some commonalities all across our state. Folks cared about education from early childhood all the way through higher ed, making sure it's accessible and affordable and quality. They care a lot about healthcare, very concerned about affordability, accessibility, and making sure you have healthcare, not just insurance. They also care a lot about economic security, things like wage theft, minimum wage, paid family leave, paid sick leave. That seemed to resonate across the state no matter who we were talking about. So when we crafted our first 10 bills, we really focused on those planks of what we can do to make sure that we're addressing those issues. But also, it was really heartening to see that Minnesotans really care about each other. They want their friends and neighbors to succeed as well as themselves. So that was really great to hear. Of course, we're also going to talk about transportation infrastructure that's desperately needed, do a lot of work on unfinished business, things like distracted driving. Like I said, I serve on the Transportation Policy and Finance Division, and we are going to hear the distracted driving bill on Tuesday. And it has a hearing in the Senate already. And we're expecting that to go through rather quickly. It had a lot of bipartisan support. Very excited that that might actually get done right away this year. And then we also have been working on transparency. A lot of us were very frustrated last year when the last 3 hours of session, a 990-page bill ended up on our desk that we hadn't seen the whole entirety of, and we were expected to vote on it in 3 hours. So when we had the opportunity to restructure our committees, we focused on transparency and did something that I was used to and Senator Latz is used to under the Senate structure, is that we put the finance committees all underneath each other under finance in divisions and the policy committee separate. So it comes very clear to members and to the public when a bill's passed a policy committee in the deadline and is in a finance committee, instead of having to guess what its pathway is or having to guess whether or not it has a chance this session. Our speaker also has encouraged all of us chairs not to do the customary 3-day notice for a meeting, which wasn't even always enforced at all, but to do it a week ahead of time. So we've already posted our meetings for next week and what we're going to be discussing. So it gives a chance for Minnesotans from all across the state to come down and have some input. We've also taken out the mute button, which I think was a great step. And a lot of other different things we're doing with the rules to make sure we're running in the most transparent fashion as we can. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Majority Leader, Representative Winkler.
Well, thanks, Cheryl. As Cheryl alluded to a couple of times, so in addition to being your representative, I was elected by the House Democratic Caucus to be the majority leader. So I work in kind of second in command to the Speaker of the House to help guide the bills on the floor, to help administer the House and deal with all of the mechanics of running the House of Representatives as an institution, and working with my colleagues throughout my caucus to make sure that the agenda that our group and the House and more broadly moves through the legislative process and is ready to go when we start negotiating with the Minnesota Senate. And just for context, you may all know, but Minnesota has the only divided legislature in the country. The Minnesota House has a majority DFL representation, and the Minnesota Senate is majority Republican, but it's only majority Republican by 1 vote. And so Minnesota is going to be testing how well 2 parties in challenging political circumstances can work together and try to accomplish something. From my perspective, helping to lead the Minnesota DFL House Caucus, I think that we have an opportunity to do our work in a much better, more transparent, and open manner than has been done in recent years. And with the collapse of the last legislative session in 2018, with the veto of a major omnibus, 900+ page omnibus bill, I don't think we could do much worse than what we saw last year. And so we think working with Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, we actually can have a very productive legislative session. The first 2 months of the session is often taken up with overviews and learning and understanding, how the state agencies and the state budget work. But we also have a lot of provisions that were vetoed in last year's big omnibus bill that we are going to try to pick up and move through the process as quickly as possible because they're largely non-controversial. And so this week we have already begun moving on a bill that appropriates funds to the Secretary of State, which came ultimately from the federal government, for the purpose of protecting our elections against cyber attacks and outside attacks in general. And so working together, both sides in the House, we are moving that legislation forward. We are doing the same thing on elder abuse, a major bill that was a fatality of last year's debacle. And so in this case, Senator Housley, who you may know ran for the U.S. Senate, and Representative Jennifer Schultz are working together to put together a package that will move in both bodies at the same time, so that we are trying to use the first 2 months of session as productively as we possibly can. And basically at the end of February is when the budget work really starts. That's when the final economic forecast comes out. That's when the governor's budget is proposed. And that's when the process really shifts fully to trying to pass a 2-year budget and deal with all of the major bills that have to be passed in order to keep the state government running. That's the other big factor here is with the federal government shutdown, in addition to affecting federal workers and federal agencies, also is starting to affect Minnesota and key programs in Minnesota that a lot of people count on, from SNAP program, which is commonly known as food stamps, to a lot of the services provided on reservations for American Indians, to any number of federal programs. As of now, the state of Minnesota is spending about $40 million per month to pay for food stamp benefits, on the hope and the understanding that we will be reimbursed by the federal government for that afterwards. But the longer this federal shutdown goes, the more dire the circumstances are, both for the economy, for the agencies like the TSA and the airports, but also for Minnesota's ability to front load money to cover federal programs. At some point, it begins to have a significant and severe budget impact for us, and it can become kind of critical time for very vulnerable people in Minnesota. So that's another aspect of our work that we have to consider as we start this session. Ultimately, our goal and our desire is to focus on advancing paid family and medical leave, gun violence protection bills, the education bills that Cheryl talked about. We have a forward-looking agenda, and we think that this session creates an opportunity both to get some of that work done with Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans, but also, to the extent that doesn't work, to make sure that Minnesotans understand that there is an agenda and a clear sense of direction from Democrats in the House and in the Senate, that we will advance an agenda that will serve their interests and help them and improve people's lives. And so we see it as both this session issue, but also a 2, 4, 6, 8-year plan to make sure that we are addressing the needs that people have. And we can talk about a lot of those issues tonight. But that's just kind of more of a framework for kind of how this session is setting up from the beginning.
I did forget to mention one of the most notable differences this year is that we have 37 new members and 2 returning. So out of the 134 that are in the legislature, Democrats are 75. Out of those 75, we have 32 new members and 2 returning. And out of the 59 in the Republican caucus, there's 5 new members. And I had the pleasure and opportunity to work with a few other members to do the 4-day new member orientation. And I'm telling you, this new class coming in is pretty incredible. We have doctors, we have MBAs, we have MSs, MAs, BSs, BAs, more JDs. It's probably one of the most educated classes I've seen come through in a very long time. And they're full of energy and full of great ideas, and they're ready to work together. And that is really going to make a big difference.
So what we'll do now, I think, is open up the conversation with you. I'll just throw out some topics that I expect that we'll be seeing this coming session by name, and then anyone who wants to come up and have a conversation about any of them, anywhere from the education funding formula increases, safe schools funding, early childhood learning, renewable energy standards, climate change initiatives, energy storage, internet privacy, net neutrality, clean water initiatives, opioids, already mentioned the provider tax sunset, Minnesota Care buy-in proposal, which is one of the governor's main initiatives, paid sick and family leave, sexual assault investigations, peace officer and standards and training board. A lot of different topics that we can talk about. Hands-free cell phones, as we've already mentioned. So come on up, whoever wants to ask us questions or make comments, please, and join us.
Mike Hendon, is there a plan to fix this budget problem where you have inflation calculated on one side and not calculated on the expense side? Or is that going to get fixed this time?
Mike, the short answer is no. I don't think it will be.
And why not? Why are people not willing to fix this?
Well, that's a good question. It makes a lot of sense from a pure budgetary standpoint to fix it. But there's some vested interests, I think, in leaving it the way it is because it ends up looking better when they talk about a budget surplus, or it makes a deficit look not quite as bad. It'd be nice if we could make that change, and some of us over the years have been trying to make some headway on it. But it was a deal a long time ago between the governor and some legislative leaders, all of whom were running for higher office at the time. And it's left us handicapped with this PR problem, if not worse. But maybe the House has got some conversation on that. I don't know.
Well, it's our plan to try to do a bill, so we'll see how that works. There's discussions already underway because we have to stop we have to talk about real numbers. And the only way we're going to do that is if we're comparing apples to apples, right?
Yes, and we have some strong interest in taking care of it. It's the problem of a short-term political pain for long-term gain for the state's economic health and financial health of the state budget. And so, I guess my hope is that with a new governor and a new administration, they would have a willingness to reopen this issue and try to get it taken care of. And the problem is that over time, if you continue to overproject how much money you have, the need to, or the kind of the freedom to cut taxes and to continue to push down the price of state government as much as possible is there because you're inflating how much money you have artificially by not including inflation. So, if you go back in time to when Arnie Carlson was the governor, the state price of government was about 18%. That means about 18% of the state economy was devoted to state and local government expenses. And today it's more like 14.5%. So we're spending a smaller share of our state economy on state and local government than we were back in the 1990s. And yet it continues to look like there is this budget surplus year in and year out. And it's creating real problems. We don't have the money to do a 2% funding formula increase for education under the current budgeting scenario. We can't provide an inflationary increase for schools under the current budget forecast that is likely to be coming up. And that is because of this inflation issue. So I personally think we need to address it. And I have hope that with a new governor and a new administration, they might be open to doing it on the front end.
Yes, sir.
My name's Cliff Cashton. I'd like to ask about Restore the Vote legislation. As you know, about 60,000 Minnesotans are denied the right to vote because they've been released from incarceration but are still under supervision. And there's legislation now introduced in the House to restore the right to vote to those people. It seems like it's likely to pass the House at some point, but its prospects are less clear in the Senate. Could you talk about your thoughts about that legislation, about its prospect for passing the Senate? Thanks.
Well, I'm proud to say I've taken the lead on Restore the Vote, or felony voting initiatives in the last several years. There are a number of other of my colleagues in the Senate have been fighting for this too. But we haven't been able to get it out of the Senate as a whole. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, you did a real nice setup, so thank you. Under current Minnesota law, if you have a felony conviction, you lose your right to vote, and your right to vote is not restored until you have completed your probation or parole period. You're completely off paper, to use a colloquial term. There are a lot of those, including myself, who believe that if you lose your vote while you're incarcerated, that's one thing, but once you're back in the community, paying taxes, participating in community life, and hopefully successfully reintegrating into your community and feeling a part of and having a stake in your community, an important part of that is being able to vote and have a role in deciding who your elected representatives will be. So we've tried a number of ways in the Senate to do that. There are some members of the majority in the Senate who are open to this concept, who have taken some serious runs at finding some compromise on this issue. I don't know whether we're going to be able to do anything this year, but there are a number of us who are going to continue trying.
Yeah, and Chair Dean has already introduced a bill in the public safety or in the elections committee. And like Senator Latz said, it has a very good chance of passing in the House this year. We also have some bipartisan support. It's a long time coming. It just creates confusion when somebody is out of the bricks and mortar of a prison and trying to participate to society, not realizing what rights do I have yet, what rights do I not. And part of that rehabilitation process and probationary process is having them be a productive member of society, and that means voting.
And just from a kind of likelihood of passage standpoint, I agreed. I expect it will pass the Minnesota House this session. I, however, think that it's part of a, fairly sizable group of bills that will run into opposition from Senate Republican leadership. I think the question is going to be, the kind of question of the session is, how many initiatives from the Minnesota House will find any kind of traction or even have a vote held in the Senate? And so we could end up with a scenario at the end of session or towards the end of session where we've got a lot of issues on the table and we have to leave some and get some passed, and we don't know where those windows of opportunity are yet with Senate Republican leaders. And so we're going to be pursuing that as many as possible. And this bill, I think, would be part of the mix. But its chance of passage at this point in time is a little bit unclear. I would also just add, Minnesota has a relatively low recidivism rate, so people don't reoffend very much in Minnesota, but we have a very long and extensive probationary system. So people are on paper for a long time. So if we're not restoring the right to vote until they're fully off paper, that is years and years, and it tends to be longer than other states. So it's, I think, even a more important issue here than it is a lot of places. And you can correct me on the details, but that's roughly the story.
No, you're right. I mean, there's a reason we have not only a comparatively low recidivism rate, but we have a very, very low incarceration rate in comparison to other states in the country. For the last 20 years, we've been anywhere from the third lowest to fourth lowest incarceration rate in the country. And we have a comparatively low crime rate as well. So what it tells you is that we are actually spending our dollars quite wisely. In general, we are locking up the most violent offenders, and the ones who don't necessarily need to be locked up are on probation and parole with community oversight. It's a less expensive way to do it, and it's working in Minnesota. By comparison, Wisconsin is flipped. Wisconsin's got about 2/3 of their folks who are convicted felons in prison and about 1/3 of them out on probation. So it's a different model, and they've got a worse recidivism and crime rate than we have in Minnesota. So we're doing things right, but it points out the dramatic impact that the felony voting restrictions can have on people in the community.
Hi, I'm Joan Hughes. I'm a little nervous, so I'm going to read. Given the,
Can you speak into the microphone though, so they can hear you?
can you hear me now?
Not very well.
I have a soft voice. Can you hear me now?
There we go.
Okay. Given the effects of climate change and the news every day in the papers about climate change and the effects we're seeing here in our great state of Minnesota, it's urgently needed to address our use of fossil fuels. And many believe the climate is right to do that. The 100% campaign that I'm just going to tell you about in a few seconds is to bring Minnesota together to do just that. The 100% campaign is a new state-based campaign advocating for an equitable, clean energy future for Minnesota. It's a multi-sector campaign to bring together the community, faith-based groups, labor, environmental partners, and individual endorsers. And the idea behind it is to change anything or everything. We need everyone in Minnesota. So the things that they're focusing on is transition to safe, clean, locally made energy solutions at scale and as quickly as we can. Create solutions that work for all Minnesotans across race, gender, class, and place. Encourage public and private investments, expand worker training, and create new energy solutions that save us money and strengthen all communities that are impacted by pollution or the transition away from fossil fuels. So we are calling on Minnesota's elected officials to commit to a pathway to go to 100% equitable and clean energy for Minnesota. And they have things spelled out a little more on the website, but there are no specific bills that we are pushing forward yet, but the idea is that we really need to get behind. Minnesota could be a leader in this, and it could really affect jobs, health, farming. You know, what's coming is not good unless we address this. So thank you.
Thank you for your comments. The
Yeah.
House just had hearings on climate change. You guys want to?
Yeah, and so we have a fairly long line of folks ready to talk, so we don't need to talk too much in response, but for the first time ever, the Minnesota House of Representatives has a climate committee, energy and climate, and the Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman, is a dedicated environmentalist, in fact, traveled to Paris as part of the climate accords, and so that issue is very, very important to the House leadership. And again, I'm very familiar with the campaign you're talking about, and I think will go well with us in the House. But back to the recurring theme, we'll see how it does in the Senate this year.
Well, we're going to try to get people to push their legislators, put a lot of pressure.
Yeah, good.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
My name's George Beck. I live in St. Louis Park. And whenever I get up here, I like to thank Senator Latz for his work on gun safety. It's so difficult, but yet so important.
Speak into the mic, please.
But my question tonight is about redistricting reform.
Wait, go back to the mic where you thanked me.
Yeah.
That was.
I said Senator Latz was great.
Thank you, George.
So the Senate comes up, the census comes up next year, 2020. 2021, you folks are responsible for a new map for our representatives and the people in Congress. My concern is that you get some advice from a commission apart from the legislature. You're not going to believe this, but some people think that legislators have a conflict of interest in drawing their own maps. And an outside body to give you some advice would be very significant, I think. We've been lucky in Minnesota, but Wisconsin wasn't. And when one party was in control there, they were terrifically gerrymandered to the extent that some 40% of the vote statewide ended up with 60% of the legislators from that party. And that's just because of the way the boundaries were drawn. So I hope we have a bill this year and I hope it passes. And my question is to each of you is, do you support reform of that nature and will you vote for it?
Well, I, for one, would like to try to get something moving while we still have the Qui Mondale Commission around to talk about it, because we did a lot of work. It was bipartisan. I know Secretary of State Simon carried it when he was in the House. I haven't had a chance to really talk to our new elections chair to see what his ideas are. Once again, the reoccurring theme, we're going to keep saying the same thing, is that Senator Kiffmeyer is the chair in the Senate, and that's a much tougher hill to climb.
I know she's a tough hill to climb. But I'm hoping that maybe in the Senate, there's 4 or 5 Republicans who are thinking about 2020 and about the prospects and the fact that redistricting reform is supported by a large number of Minnesotans. And Common Cause Minnesota is working hard on this year, and will bring a lot of people to the House or the Senate if there's a hearing. So
George, this may be one area where having a split legislature would work to create some momentum toward a bipartisan or nonpartisan independent redistricting committee. I personally would support one.
And so would I.
And they have to be worried about you folks gerrymandering in 2021. So they ought to be in on this bill. Thank you very much.
That's right.
Hi, I'm Hillary Bestie from St. Louis Park. And I would like to hear from you where you stand on expanding MinCare to anyone that wants to participate in it.
Well, Hillary, I'm a strong supporter. In fact, for our Minnesota Values Plan that the House introduced, creating the Minnesota Care Buy-in was one of our top 10 bills. And so there is strong support in the House, and House leadership is very much behind it, including me. And I think it is a path to having a public option in healthcare where people can be part of it, and that public healthcare option can start to negotiate lower prices from providers and from pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies, and start to bend seriously the cost curve on healthcare. I don't think without it we're going to be doing anything other than fighting runaway healthcare inflation.
Yes, and it was House File 3, Representative Liebling, the chair of Health and Human Service Finance, is carrying it, but it was kind of a skeleton of a bill. And we all know with things like this, the devil's in the details. And over the last 4 years, we've never been even able to talk about the details. So looking forward to really robust hearings that we can talk about how we're going to fund it, looking at repealing the provider tax so we can continue to fund Minnesota Care. And then also what we're going to do about reimbursement rates to make sure that our hospitals and our nursing homes, especially in greater Minnesota, can still afford to keep patients there.
I'm less optimistic about hearings on this proposal in the Senate. The current majority in the Senate has not been real supportive. Actually, they've been very hostile toward this idea, primarily based on their view that bringing basically public sector buying power into the private marketplace is going to be unfair competition for the private insurers. But as we've seen, the private insurance market has not been successful in extending coverage to all Minnesotans who ought to have coverage. So we need to find a different way to do it. And I think this is a good way for us to do it.
Good. Well, I also was wondering if we do that, and with MinCare as it is, would you support direct contracting where the state is contracting with the providers directly, rather so that our public programs will be publicly administered rather than privately administered?
I'll just
Yeah, go ahead.
So that is very much what we anticipate to be part of our Minnesota Care Buy-in plan. As Cheryl mentioned, the House author and chair of the Health and Human Services Finance Committee has spoken directly about direct purchasing as a way to drive out costs that help to bridge the gap between what providers are expecting and what patients can afford.
And I believe Senator Jensen, a Republican family practice doctor in the Senate, has come out with a smaller version of a bill to talk about just small ways. If it's kind of almost the way I was hearing it on NPR is the things that you'd go to a minute clinic for, to be able to directly contract with your doctor and just go in and pay a flat fee without having to go through insurance. So that'll be interesting to see if that gets in play.
Yeah, good. It'll also increase transparency. So thank you.
Hi there. So I'm the second George you'll hear from this evening, which is kind of fun. I want to thank the three of you for being here tonight. It's not everybody that does what you do. You always listen to the community, and that's so appreciated. So really appreciate that. Appreciate your work in getting more transparency in bills and making it clear to the public when things happen so that it isn't this run, things are changing at the last minute. Your work with prison reform is fantastic. And I certainly support Karen Housley's elder abuse bill, and I pray that it gets passed this year by both the House and the Senate. So with that, the reason I'm here is to talk to you about shared parenting. I'm a father of 3, happen to be about the same age as your children, Senator Latz. My oldest is a junior down at Gustavus. I have a senior in high school, and I have a 6th grader. I was divorced about 4 years ago. And what I learned through the process is, though I was a great father and did all the things with my kids that I always have done, once you enter the realm of the family court, there isn't a presumption of equality. Fathers and mothers are not treated equally. Parents are not treated equally. So there became what I'll call a jump ball, where if I wanted to remain in my children's life, which I really wanted to do, I had to fight for them. There was no presumption of equality in the family court. And I found that really, really shocking. And I talked to several friends that had been divorced, and many of them saw their kids every other weekend and Wednesday night. And I learned that wasn't by choice. That was an edict from the court itself. So I'm here asking about a presumption of shared parenting, something that the family court would look at mothers and fathers equally, and there'd be an equal starting place for both parents, so that the children could enjoy equal access and equal time with both of their parents. I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
I'll take this one.
Sure. This is a really complicated question. I appreciate you bringing it up, and I'm sorry that you're in the situation that you're in, George.
Well, I've got 50% with my children. My youngest is 50%. My older are gone. I've fought my battle. I just hate to see people. I know so many people running through it right now. So many children are born out of wedlock, and 50% of marriages end in divorce. So this problem continues to grow. And I believe in equality.
We had extensive hearings on this in the Senate over the last several years. There were actually a lot of reforms that were passed after a consensus was developed among a wide range of stakeholders in the family law area on all sides of the issues. And there were some areas that the consensus could not develop. And one of those was on the question of how you implement shared parenting. Once you start doing formulas, there are ways that shared parenting presumptions can affect the formulas of how much money is spent and by whom and for what purpose. And it gets into a lot of complexities. And this is the area where there aren't a lot of experts at the legislature. This is an area where we tend to rely on the people that are involved in the field, advocates for fathers, advocates for mothers, divorce lawyers who are on all sides of the discussion, the guardian ad litems that are involved often in making advice anyway to the family courts and the courts themselves. So the last time we tackled an issue relating to this range of laws, it took about 4 years and an outside mediator to come up with a consensus that we could pass at the legislature. And the consensus at that time was to not make any actual statutory presumptions about parenting time. Because once you get into that area, it makes it much more difficult for a judge to fashion particular decisions in each case that will work out for a family.
Respectfully, though, isn't that overcomplicating it? Shouldn't mothers and fathers be considered equal?
Well,
unless there's some reason to the contrary. I mean,
well, let me put it.
I find it really, really crazy that in today's world, we can't think of mothers and fathers as being equal, but.
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. And first of all, let me say 95% of the cases are resolved in negotiations between the parties and aren't imposed upon the family by a family court judge. But when you get to the point of imposing decisions, you've got to sort out, what if one parent travels a lot for work? What if one parent lives further away and isn't able to do child care pickup and drop off or school pickup and drop off?
So those are extenuating circumstances that need to be addressed.
The
yes.
problem is the presumptions that you put into law make it hard for judges to account for some of those extenuating circumstances. What's the threshold going to be before a judge can override the statutory presumptions? And you get a drop off in terms of the calculated payments between one party and another as well. So it's a far too complicated.
I'm talking about
George,
time, not
if I
parity,
may,
but-
it's a far too complicated area for us to spend a lot of time in a
Okay.
large public
May I ask-
forum on, but I appreciate you raising the topic. I don't expect it's going to come up again in the Senate this year because we have far too many other issues that we haven't dealt with recently that we have to tackle.
May I ask the two of you?
Sure. I have quite a bit of personal experience with this issue. And without getting into too many details, this is handled very differently in European family courts, where in fact a presumption is equal parenting between mothers and fathers. And the kind of American standard is best interest of the child. But I think the issue is that we have a lot of cultural associations about what it means to be a mother and what it means to be a father. And those cultural biases play into the legal system's definition of best interest of the child. And so I think in many ways we are kind of dealing with a court system that is moded in what I would consider to be rather backward view of what mothers and fathers do. And in fact, not how people live today. So I am more open to a change, although I think it's important to recognize that it doesn't happen just by passing a law. Judges and the court system is its own culture, its own set of institutional norms and so forth. And so to make the change that you're talking about isn't just done by law. It has to be done by evolution. And, it's very difficult and fraught conversations to do anything at all. And people's livelihoods, their sense of, who they are and their identity, and, there are so many things involved. And so I think it's important to raise it. I don't think the legislature can kind of snap its fingers and make it change, but I do think that it's the right direction to go in.
And I think discussions still need to continue too. And like Senator Latz said, we don't have a lot of experts up at the legislature. We rely a lot on the experts in the field. And I have been watching over the last 4 years, those experts really dig in hard and try to figure something out to move the needle. And they have. That doesn't mean the needle should stop. It means we should continue to look at it, but it's a really complicated area.
Yeah, thank you. I don't feel the needle has really moved for real people who have a problem and have to go to court. What I will tell you is that there is a bill in the House now, and it's going to have bipartisan support. Last year, of course, we went through the House committee, passed. We couldn't get a hearing in the Senate Judiciary, but it would be fantastic if we could at least get a hearing in the Senate Judiciary this year. So thank you.
I suggest you ask the chair. Thank you, George.
Hi, I'm Judy Chucker from St. Louis Park, and I want to thank all three of you. You've always been a reliable vote for the environment, and because you believe in science, and that's so important. I'll pick one topic out of the environment to talk about now, and that is pesticide use, specifically neonicotinoids, and not just neonics, but all systemic pesticides. There's one easy way to make sure that our water improves, and that is by re-registering, reclassifying these pesticides as restricted use. In other words, they would be just in the hands of licensed applicators, and they would be removed from the shelves of our hardware stores and big box stores, where most people have no idea when they pick up a can. It doesn't say neonic, which a lot of people are familiar with that term. It doesn't say that. It'll say methylphenidate, or not methylphenidate. That is, I believe, an amphetamine. But you understand, it has the scientific names on there.
Both are
And-
bad.
What's that?
Both are bad.
Yeah. So apparently there is bipartisan support for such a move, which is unusual. In fact, even the Landscape Association supports it, removing that and reclassifying the systemics as, what did I call it? Restricted use pesticides. So I hope that you perhaps will co-sponsor it or just keep your eye out for any legislation like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
The good news in the House is one of our neonicotinoid specialists, Rick Hansen's the environment chair.
Yes.
And thank you. I have a daughter who's a biochemistry major and in med school now. So yes, I believe in science. It's very important. But no, I think that discussion's been around and we have a real champion in the right place to do something.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deb Ellsworth from St. Louis Park, and I wanted to ask about redistricting reform. That's a hard word to say. And since the other guy, was he a George too, I think?
Yes.
Since the other George already asked about it, what I would like to do is second what he said and just say that I've always been really proud of St. Louis Park for having such high voting rates and really proud of Minnesota. I think we had the highest voting rate again this year in the election, right? I think we're like a really leader in the democracy. And you know, with all the stuff we do with the same day registration and the paper ballots and all that. And now you just mentioned the cyber attack thing. We're already getting on that. So I think it would be really cool if you could convince all your fellow legislators that we could be the country's leader in how to do fair, impartial redistricting reform as well. And they'll follow our Minnesota model. Maybe. Thank you.
And our homegrown Secretary of State, St. Louis Park model, and Steve Simon.
Hi there. I'm Bethany Penna. I'm a resident of St. Louis Park. And first of all, I want to second the comment that was made, just thanking Senator Latz and Representative Joachim. I know we've worked together in the past on comprehensive gun reform. And I am really proud to be from where I am from and to have such champions of gun sense legislation in our local government. So my first part is, Mr. Winkler, it's nice to meet you. And I was wondering where you stand on all of this. I'm not familiar with your record in particular. So that would be my first question, is just if you could give your perspective on the gun sense legislation bills specifically mentioned by Senator Latz. And then a second question that was brought up by another Moms Demand Action person that I was speaking with was, last year there seemed to be a bit of a focus on bump stocks as well in some of this legislation. And wondering if there was something in particular behind that not being pushed as much this year, but really thankful for the comprehensive laws that are being presented. And also, not that you haven't thought of this, but one nice way to sort of cross over into the Senate with this red flag law is just the incredibly high rate of suicide among our farmers. And I think it's a staggering percent, in the high 70s, I believe, of those deaths are by guns. And so something like a red flag law that helps us put in, extreme protection orders, extreme risk protection orders for those people could really benefit people who live in the more rural areas of our state as well. So just wanted to see your opinions.
Well, I guess went directly to me first. So I do support the two bills. In fact, the top 10 bills that the House introduced, those two bills were in them. And so as the majority leader, I was part of the decision-making process to make sure that we were prioritizing this issue. And we can talk a lot about the merits, which is important, but the politics have been what's really changed. And I want to thank you for your advocacy on the issue. We never used to see red shirts like that at the state capitol. Historically, common sense gun legislation was broadly supported, but there was no well-organized constituency pushing it. And on the other hand, the Second Amendment folks were very well organized. And in general, at the legislature and in politics, a few people who care a lot can do more than a whole bunch of people who only care a little bit. And so changing that dynamic where there is now a political price to be paid for opposing gun violence prevention bills exists, and it never used to. And it changed with Parkland, and it changed with the advocacy of people like you and high school students and people all over the state and the nation. And that is why the dynamic has shifted, and that is why I think these bills have a chance. It will be difficult in the Senate, but I think if you had to vote in the Senate, a majority of members would vote to pass those two bills. The question is whether Senate leaders let a vote like that ever happen.
I think it depends on the details in some of the bills too. There are some versions of bills that we've tried in the past that didn't get as broad support. And there might be a time to go into some of this. One of the big concerns that's raised by the Second Amendment advocates is creating a gun registry. And there are ways to do background checks that will not create a registry or even something that could be argued to be a registry. I think Ryan is exactly right. The politics have changed because now the gun violence reduction advocates who are supporting these two bills are gaining political traction. And it's become an issue that is decisive in more and more voters' minds as they're deciding which candidate to vote for. That's where you really touch the hearts and the votes of elected officials. The Senate was not up for re-election this year, but we will be in 2 years. And there are a number of Senate districts now where suburban moms voted on this as one of their important issues. And that means there are probably 4 or 5 suburban senators that have not been supporters of this in the past that will be more compelled to vote for these bills as they're looking toward re-election in 2020. I'm cautiously optimistic. It is a leadership decision whether they're going to let these bills go through the normal policy track. We will try some procedural efforts to get a vote on the substance as well, and we're going to have to rely on the House to help tee up that final negotiation at the end of session. With regard to bump stocks, there are a lot of bills that we could be offering that would move in this direction. Bump stocks is one of them. We, among the people who are most active in fashioning the strategy here, have concluded that we think we'll be better off just focusing our attention on the 2 main bills that we think will make the most difference, and not giving time or energy toward the other bills, and also not giving the opportunity to vote for the other less meaningful bills and say that they've done enough, and then vote against the bills that we really think would make a difference. And so, bump stocks, as horrific as they are, have not been used much in public, have not been used much in the gun violence and the deaths that we see around the country. It became well known because of the Las Vegas shooting when it was used, but statistically, it's hardly ever used at all. So to advance gun safety, we're not going to gain a whole lot by banning bump stocks. We will gain a lot by screening out those who are ineligible to purchase guns and making it that much harder for people who have domestic violence convictions, who have violent felony convictions, who have mental health commitments that put them at risk from being able to purchase guns. And so we think we'll make more safety benefits by focusing on the 2.
And the only thing I really have to add is thank you, thank you. It really does help to have all those personal stories up at the Capitol and the pressure on folks. And I think we also will see a difference. We have a governor who has come out and been firmly supportive and will be a partner in this as well.
Thank you all for your work.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Bennett Shields. I'd like to bring to your attention and talk about records, government information and data, transparency and sunshine laws. My experience has been shared by a lot of people. Getting information, medical records, information about a government program or a government employee I get nothing but constant resistance. I've needed to do this for some cases I'm working on as I was in a car crash, also taking care of my mom and this type of thing. What I tend to get from these people is a lot of excuses. The people at the working the counter at these various government organizations or a nursing institution, they'll come up with one reason or another of why I can't have it. And I've had to make numerous trips to get this. And I've met a lot of other people that have had similar problems. They want, in one case, is over at Sholem Home for my mom's records, $550 for the records. I don't have it. I made it very clear to him. Then he refused to let me photograph them or to copy them. And I talked to a lawyer, said, there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. He wouldn't back down, wouldn't get back to me. I still don't have the records. Often when I've talked to these people at the counter, they'll start talking about HIPAA or privacy. And I've had to go back and look up the laws or the policy pertaining to it and show it to them that I have a right to it, that anybody has a right to it. Sometimes that's worked, many times it won't. They just won't back down. I've had them ask, why do you want this information? I don't have to give you that reason. I want it, it's mine, I have a right to it. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to share it? It's inappropriate and unethical for them to ask these questions, and I shouldn't have to answer them. And they shouldn't even be asking it. In the case of, I've had to get some police records. Edina Police, I had to get 2 trips to get the records, and they backed down pretty good. City of Richfield, I had to work my way up to a city council member, multiple trips, Richfield Police Department. 5 months later, I got a sheet of paper that had almost no information on it. It's like, why wouldn't you give me this? There's nothing on it anyway. Minneapolis Police, I had to work my way up to Chief Rondo, to the point where he actually knows me at the community meetings. Hi, Bennett, you still got those records? Took me eight months. And so I was able to get them, but citizens should not have to do that kind of work to get it. And what I feel, the statutes, the way they're written, I think it's pretty clear that people have a right to these records. But they look at it and they say, when I say they, I'm the people working the counter or the people working the departments that handle records. They start looking at wiggle room and they start playing games with these words. And I think that some of these statutes need to be reworded or not give these people the wiggle room they're looking at. I've had them where they say, well, you should talk to a lawyer. It's right here, sir. Can you read this? And they just won't back down. And you kind of get the idea they're playing games with you and just don't want to release the information. I can kind of see where they're seeing that, but so I think that it needs to be reworded. I think that citizens need to have more, the legislation needs to give people more rights. It needs to be more clear as to what the rights are. And there needs to be more teeth, because ultimately you walk out of there with nothing and they win. I have nothing. What are you going to do? Call the police? I mean, I've talked to other elected officials, appointed officials, but there's no enforcement. I have nothing and they know it.
Well, I mean, the Minnesota Data Practices Act is pretty clear. Information is considered public and you have a right to it unless some exception applies. And, you know, I have to say that I haven't, in recent years, maybe recent months, or the last year or two, I've been hearing more and more stories like this, both from state agencies and at local units of government. And I wonder if a cultural shift or some shift is taking place slowly that is making agencies more resistant to providing information. Because ultimately, you know, you could sue them, but that's not much of a remedy to get information that you have a right to. So I guess from my point of view, I don't know if new laws are required or if better education and enforcement is required. But it's something I'm willing to look into.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo what Representative Winkler had to say. The laws have been around for a long time. They're complicated, but they've got a structure. With private organizations, in particular health organizations, I know that they're concerned about HIPAA and federal law and being liable for releasing records, being sued on the other end.
Yeah, they're liable,
other
but we
side.
also
So-
have rights. It goes both
Right.
ways.
Well, and there's some tension there.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, a lawsuit is an expensive and difficult and lengthy process to go through to get the records. I tend to think it has more to do with the culture of resistance to that than it has to do with the current statutes.
And more education. A lot of the times people are erring on the side of caution and thinking they don't have to release it, and they do. And it's like Senator Latz and Representative Winkler said, it's not, the laws are there. It's just a matter of trying to make sure that folks are actually following them.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Deb Brinkman, St. Louis Park.
As you know, St. Louis Park recently passed ranked choice voting. Thank you for your support of ranked choice voting and for supporting local control. We know that that's really important. So we were able to do this because we were able to change our home rule charter. But 85% of the cities in Minnesota are governed by statute instead of charter. So would you support a local options bill that would allow all cities in Minnesota to choose for themselves whether or not they wanted ranked choice voting for their municipal elections? That one's easy, yes.
Yes, I would too.
Yes, I support it.
Thank you.
Hi, Rich Goldschmidt from Plymouth, and I want to thank you for inviting me to come to this meeting. I'm concerned about the data practices as well, and I'm hoping that you will all find a way to support a bill that is going to be introduced by Senator Kiffmeyer that is intended to give lottery winners the choice to keep their personal information private. I think this is an important issue because it appears that criminals are actually targeting lottery winners, and they're using the information that is provided by the lottery in order to do that. And basically, these are preventable crimes, and a small change in data policy could prevent crimes. It's also an issue that costs no money to implement, so there's no expenditure of funds that goes along with this. It's also a popular issue. As part of the work that I've done in developing the white paper that you may have had a chance to read, and I'll provide you a copy, I talked with a lot of people who play the lottery, and basically it's universal that people who play want to have the choice to keep their personal information private if they win. The consequences are very real and significant. People are basically bombarded with scams, offers to be financial advisors, and even violent crimes. And in my white paper, I listed a variety of violent crimes that have been perpetrated against lottery winners. I think that it's important to try and prevent those crimes. It's also the case that a lot of other jurisdictions have recognized that this is an important issue. So there originally were about half a dozen states that kept the names of lottery winners private unless they wanted their information to be public. They have not had any difficulties as a result of having done that. And so there's been a growing trend in that direction. The state of Georgia, in response to a very public murder of a lottery winner, recently changed its laws to do that, to give winners a choice. The same thing has happened in several other states as well. And there are, in total, if you count the states that in addition to having the right kinds of data practices that are protective, if you also count states that allow people who win to file using trusts and don't make public the name of the ticket holder, and if you also add in the states that have actively considered legislation to change their law in the way that I'm talking about to protect their citizens, we're talking about roughly 20 states out of 43 that have state lotteries. So this is an issue that's been getting more attention. It's important, and there is going to be legislation introduced by Senator Kiffmeyer. I hope that this is something that'll get some bipartisan support and that we can see passed in order to protect people without having to spend any money. And it's an issue that I believe would be very popular.
Thank you. I don't know a lot about the issue other than what you've described. I'm inclined toward that position that you're advocating for. I would want to hear the policy debate before making a final decision.
Okay,
I agree.
Me too.
great. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My name's Rick Gravrock. I'm a resident of St. Louis Park for 26 years, back when Gail Dorfman was on the city council here. And obviously, I'm a big champion of Moms Demand Action and sensible gun laws. And I'm a former preschool teacher. And I'm a huge champion for kids. And so for me, the biggest issue is climate issues. We really need to do everything we can to do what we can to work with the planet and the conditions that we have right now. As a supporter of moms, I'm going to share a mom joke with you. What did the mother buffalo say when her son went off to play?
What?
Bye, son.
Bye, son.
So one thing I also was going to talk about the local option bill, which, would allow other cities. Would that bill allow cities to do more than just vote for or elect ranked choice voting?
I'd have to
It's-
see the language. I'm
I
not
think
sure.
it's focused on ranked choice
Yeah.
voting.
It is.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And when it comes to gun sense, there's a website called Stand Up Daily. If we could get standupdaily.org, if people could stand up on a daily basis, like in the middle of their lunch line at work or school, and just put a hand in the air for a moment of silence. We did this with 500,000 people in New York City, and it was extremely powerful. And if we could get people to do that on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, whenever it worked for them, we could really make some changes. And if you go to that website, the thing you'll see there that's being like the next thing to talk about is about returning the federal assault weapons ban, which was started when? 1994. And it ended in 2004 when they did not renew it. So if we could get that as one of the things that the legislature deals with, that would be awesome. So,
Well, that's a federal
Yeah.
law,
Right.
and Minnesota can address those same issues at the state level. But as Ron said, the focus right now is on those two primary bills. But
Thank you.
thank you very much for what you're doing. Yay.
Thank you.
thanks.
Go ranked choice voting.
I'm Lori Anderson Tepley, and I've lived in St. Louis.
A little more.
I know, I'm quiet and nervous. So my name is Lori Anderson Tepley. My name is Lori Anderson Tepley. I've lived in St. Louis Park since 1981, so that long time. Love it here. I'm here to speak about shared parenting as well, although I won't be as eloquent as the first gentleman. And thank you for your comments and your email. When growing up, my mom was the foundation of our family, but my dad was the glue. Had 4 siblings, so they had their hands full, but they did a great job. My mom excelled at making sure I gained the skills I would need in life, and my dad made sure that I believed in myself. Everyone says that our son, excuse me, Ryan takes after my dad. This is new for us, so it's harder. Ryan's relationship with his partner ended last winter, which is always painful, especially with children involved. But he has a beautiful, smart 1-year-old daughter, and we all adore her. After his partner moved to St. Cloud, he didn't get to see her much. They weren't married, but she lived in his home, and he took care of her 8-year-old daughter as well, paid for everything. This was heartbreaking for all of us because we love both of the girls. And Ryan, he is a father like his grandpa. He wants to be involved with everything. He's doing ECFE classes. He chose to start seeing a family therapist so he could provide whatever Livy needed. Wants the best for her. And we, in many regards, were lucky. Last spring, Ryan received court-ordered parenting time in the amount of 92 hours every 2 weeks, and that was for a 4-month-old. And that was unexpected for an infant. This judge has always been accommodating and fair to my son for some reason. But the initial court order is just temporary. And Ryan is trying his best to settle out of court, but it doesn't look like that will happen. And there's a date set for mid-May. This process has been challenging. By the time trial is over, we will have spent, I'm so sorry, over $100,000 through a home equity loan and refinancing. The thought of spending this kind of money takes our breath away. In 2011, my husband, who used to be a civil engineer, had a significant medical crisis and our income decreased significantly. So we're trying to do this trial to keep Livy in our lives. And our current annual income is about $43,000. Neither one of our two options at the moment are easy if we don't go to trial. We risk losing the relationship we have with our granddaughter and our son with his daughter, which seems unbearable. Imagine, if you will, if this were your child. If we do go to trial, we possibly risk losing everything and not have the resources to cover our medical expenses. I've been a type 1 diabetic for most of my life, take excellent care of myself and in great health, but it's an expensive disease. At best, we'll be in debt for the rest of our lives. This is terrifying, but not as unbearable as losing Livy. Children and their well-being are a priority for my family. For many years, I worked in ECFE and then facilitated primary project and early intervention program for preschoolers. My daughter's now an early childhood special ed teacher. We want Livy to have every opportunity to be the best that she can be, and we can help provide a stability that she may not have with her mom. Both parents love her, but that's something we can provide. Livy has two parents who want to be in her life. They each offer their own unique strengths to parenting. A shared parenting bill would allow both the mother and father to feel valued and supported as parents without having to fight, without going bankrupt. My husband and I have always lived within our means. We've never faced a financial crisis like this before. If the courts and legal system chose to support parents in this way, you would be creating a healthier platform for parents, which in turn would benefit our children. Supported and healthy parents leads to supported and healthy children. This is putting the needs of our children first. And I won't put any pressure on you. You don't need to respond. I'm a very private person. This was not easy to share this with you. I only did so because you are the only ones who have the ability to make a difference. And I would just ask that you review the bill, maybe review some of the academic studies that are out there. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for sharing your story with us.
And best of luck. It is not an easy thing to go through.
And thank you for sharing your story via email too.
It's 7:30 now, and we have a few people left in line, so we're going to do this maybe as sort of a lightning round.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you could,
Yeah, absolutely.
if you could just keep your comments down to 1 minute each, and we'll respond if we think it's appropriate. And anyone else who wants to talk with us can stick around after we adjourn the formal meeting. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Well, my name is Cale Birchschneider. I have been a Minnesotan for about a week and a half.
Congratulations.
Welcome.
Yeah, so
Now that's civic engagement. I like that.
yeah. So I just wanted to thank you all for having this event and echo those sentiments. This is not an event that often happens in my home state. I work at a middle school on the east side of St. Paul, and it's in the realm of social work and counseling. And one thing that I've noticed is that myself and a lot of my coworkers, the students that we deal with are struggling with mental health. And we do what we can do in the school to kind of tackle that. But I just wanted to know how you three feel about mental health funding with students and adolescents, but also when they become adults, because that can affect so many other issues. Thank you.
Well, first, thank you for the work you do. And I know St. Paul school districts are wonderful. We just had folks come in and talk to us about it in our education, finance, and policy committees. They're also a majority minority school district. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in closing the opportunity gap. And our House File 2 that we did has money for mental health linked school-based settings. We're really pushing hard to look at the whole child and know that so much of the things that come with the children come from outside. Trauma-based training, restorative justice training is needed in our schools, ACEs training, and most of all, we absolutely need to get the school counselor ratio in a better place. We are at the bottom of the barrel of states, 750 students per one counselor. So thank you so much for your work. I know we have your backs.
Hello,
Hello.
I'm Shirley Johnson. I live in St. Louis Park. Where are you? Yes, hold on. All right, you're my prop, so just hold on. Okay. I am the Dean of Fine Arts and Communications at North Hennepin Community College. And yes, I have gone over to the dark side. I was a faculty member, president of the Faculty Association, and now I am a dean. And all I am here to do tonight is to introduce you to someone, and that is my prop. I have two things. This is my handout concerning why it's important to visit and perhaps support North Hennepin. This is Dr. Barbara McDonald, and she is president of North Hennepin Community College. Again, all we're asking for, guys, is your support as the higher ed bills go through the legislature. We are under increasing pressure. I've seen that now from a dean's perspective. Enrollments are low. Tuition is frozen, and we have to make tough choices. We have to make tough choices about what programs continue. We have to make tough choices about student fees. We have to make tough choices about the amount of advising and counseling we have available to our student. These are all hard things that we have to do every single day. We need your support. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Thank
you very much, Shirley, and thank you for having us here tonight. And first of all, I want to thank you very much for the work that you do in the state of Minnesota and for the support that you give to higher education. We really appreciate it. Just to echo some of Shirley's comments, we educate over 80% of Minnesota's workforce. We serve nearly 400,000 students. At North Hennepin, not only are we having to make tough choices, but our students are facing increasing issues around things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, et cetera. So we're asked by our business and industry partners to produce the workforce for the future. And what we need is the funding to make that happen. So as we look at looming shortages in the workforce, we're here to help, but we need the support to do that work. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you.
I think you have three strong higher education supporters here.
That's right.
And someone who has 3 kids in higher ed right now, so.
Hi, Barb Person from St. Louis Park. And as you know, as a strong member of the League of Women Voters in St. Louis Park and throughout the state, one of our real big priorities is voter registration. And so without going into the lengthier paragraph I was going to read about it, I just want to know if you will support automatic voter registration.
Yes.
Yes.
When you
so And when have you for a
when
long
you
time.
when
Yes,
you move
that's
great. So when you move and change your address on your driver's license, it would automatically update your voter registration and everything. So
Also lovingly called motor voter.
motor
Yes.
voter, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, oh great, thank you very much because we really need it.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Barb.
thank you.
Grand finale.
Yay. I'm Elaine Savick from St. Louis Park, and nice to see the three of you together again.
Yeah.
Just a brief comment. One of the issues we've been working at here in St. Louis Park is housing. Is there any movement in the state about housing stability, housing support, particularly with the federal money for like Section 8? Are people getting paid anymore? Is that all caught up in the shutdown? I'm just curious.
Well, one good thing with our new House organization, we actually have an entire committee that's dedicated to housing and talking about that issue. So I'm looking forward to a lot of good conversations this year.
Thank you.
You know, and Governor Dayton had a task force on housing initiatives, and I think the legislature will be looking seriously at the recommendations there as well.
Yes.
Could you take 2 minutes and just tell us the difference between how WALS is going to work and how
Well, we're trying to figure
No.
that out
Well-
still.
We'll tell you after
No.
session when we figure that out.
That's right.
I just know I really
Yeah.
like his lieutenant governor.
Yeah, that's right. The question was whether or not we would take a few minutes to talk about how Governor Dayton and Governor Walz differ in their approaches to working with us. And we'll find out. They're different personalities, but that doesn't mean we can't all get something done in different ways with different types of people. That's how we get along in the legislature and accomplish things in a large body. And we all done it in the minority and in the majority as well. And we've done it with the support of the people in this community. So thank you for the fantastic turnout here tonight. This is terrific. We really appreciate you being here. Don't let the communication stop. We all have websites and emails and telephone numbers, and we take snail mail too, for those of you inclined to do so.
Facebook,
And if you show
Twitter.
up at the Capitol, we'll meet with you.
Yes.
That's true, we will. So thank you and have a great evening.